The spring of 1945 brought an eerie quiet to the ruins of Würzburg. Where once the thunder of artillery had shaken the earth day and night, now only the cawing of ravens broke the stillness. The ancient Bavarian city, once a jewel of Baroque architecture, lay broken like a child's discarded toy. 75% of its buildings had been reduced to rubble during the bombing raids of March, and what the bombs had spared, the final battle had claimed. Private First Class James Reilly of the 42nd Infantry Division walked through streets that no longer had names. The signs had been blown away, the landmarks obliterated. His boots crunched on broken glass and plaster dust, and the smell, that terrible mixture of smoke, cordite, and death, still lingered in the warm May air, despite the capitulation 3 weeks prior. "Never thought I'd see the end of it," said Corporal Danny Sullivan, walking beside him. "When we crossed the Rhine, I figured we'd be fighting all the way to Berlin." Reilly nodded, but said nothing. The war in Europe had officially ended on May 8th, but the date felt arbitrary. How could you declare an end to something that still surrounded you, that lived in every bombed-out building and hollow-eyed face? Their company had been tasked with occupation duties, maintaining order, searching for weapons, documenting the devastation. But mostly, Reilly realized, they were witnesses to a civilization's collapse. The German military had surrendered, but the German people were still fighting to survive each day. Near what had once been the cathedral square, Reilly noticed movement in the rubble. A woman emerged from what must have been a cellar, her dress torn and filthy, her face gaunt. She carried a small child, perhaps 3 years old, wrapped in a threadbare coat despite the mild weather. Behind her came 2 more children, a girl of maybe 7 and a boy of 10, their eyes too old for their years. The woman froze when she saw the American soldiers. Her arms tightened around the child, and Reilly saw her body tense, ready to flee or fight or simply collapse. He had seen that look before, the expression of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fear. "Nick Sheeson," she whispered. "Don't shoot." Her voice was barely audible. Reilly held up his hands, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "It's okay, ma'am," he said gently, though he knew she probably couldn't understand English. "We're not going to hurt you." The woman didn't move. The little girl behind her began to cry softly. Sullivan fumbled in his pack and pulled out a chocolate bar, part of his K-rations. He broke it in half and extended it toward the children, his movements slow and deliberate. "Chocolate," he said, butchering the pronunciation. For a long moment, nobody moved. The woman's eyes darted between the soldiers' faces, searching for deception, for danger. Then, slowly, the 10-year-old boy stepped forward. His hand trembled as he reached for the chocolate. The moment his fingers touched it, he snatched it back and retreated to his mother's side. The woman's face crumpled. She made a sound, not quite a sob, not quite a gasp, and tears began to stream down her hollow cheeks. She said something in rapid German, words tumbling over each other, her voice breaking. Reilly didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. He had seen enough in this war to recognize gratitude born from desperation, kindness received when cruelty was expected. June 2, 1945. 42nd Infantry Division Headquarters, Verdsburg. Captain Robert Morrison read the directive from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force for the 3rd time. General Eisenhower's orders were clear: maintain strict non-fraternization with German civilians. The logic was sound. These were the enemy, the people who had supported Hitler, who had allowed the atrocities to happen. Soldiers were not to share food, not to show sympathy, not to forget who had started this war. Morrison understood the reasoning. He had been at Dachau when they liberated the concentration camp in April. The images, skeletal prisoners, mass graves, the industrial machinery of death, were burned into his mind. How could you show kindness to the people who had enabled such horror? Yet the reports coming across his desk told a different story. His men were sharing rations. They were helping civilians clear rubble. They were giving blankets to children who shivered in the ruins. Each act was a violation of orders, but Morrison found himself unable to enforce the rules with the vigor headquarters demanded. "Sir, Private Reilly is here to see you," said his aide, Sergeant Martinez. Reilly entered, still dusty from patrol, and saluted. "Sir, I need to report something." Morrison gestured for him to continue. "My squad encountered a group of civilians yesterday. Women and children, about 15 of them, living in a bombed-out basement on Friedrich Street. They have no food, no clean water. There's a baby, sir, maybe 6 months old. The baby isn't going to make it without help." Morrison studied the young soldier's face. Reilly couldn't have been more than 22, but his eyes held the weight of someone much older. He had earned a Bronze Star at the Battle of the Bulge and been wounded at Aschaffenburg. He was a good soldier, Morrison knew, not the type to disobey orders lightly. "You know the policy, Private." "Yes, sir." Reilly's jaw was set. "Permission to speak freely?" Morrison nodded. "Sir, I didn't join this army to watch babies starve. We came here to stop evil, to end tyranny. I saw what they did at those camps. We all did. But these women, these kids, they're not SS officers. They're not camp guards. They're just people who lost everything." He paused. "My grandmother came from Germany, sir. Immigrated in 1903. If the timing had been different, that could be my family in that basement." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. He thought of his own orders, of the chain of command, of the righteous anger that had fueled them across Europe. He thought of the concentration camps and the murdered millions. But he also thought of the Sermon on the Mount his mother had taught him as a child, of the parable of the Good Samaritan. "Private Reilly, I cannot authorize the distribution of military supplies to enemy civilians," he said formally. Then, more quietly, he added, "However, if certain soldiers were to share their personal rations on their own initiative, outside of official channels, I would have no direct knowledge of such actions. Do you understand?" A flicker of relief crossed Reilly's face. "Yes, sir. Perfectly, sir." "Dismissed." The basement on Friedrich Street had once been a wine cellar. Now it housed humanity in its most reduced state. 17 people, mostly women and children, crowded into the damp stone chamber where the only light came from candles made of rendering fat and twisted cloth. Margarete Hoffman sat against the cold wall, her infant daughter Anna pressed against her chest. At 31, she felt ancient. Her husband, Klaus, had died at Stalingrad 3 years ago. Her parents had perished in the March bombing. Her home was rubble. Everything she owned in the world was a tattered blanket and the clothes on her back. Anna whimpered, and Margarete felt her heart constrict. Her milk had dried up 2 weeks ago. There simply wasn't enough food in her own body to produce it. She had been feeding the baby water mixed with flour paste, but even flour was running out. She knew what came next. She had already seen it happen to the Schultz baby last week. "Mama, I'm hungry," whispered her son, Thomas, pressing against her side. He was 8 but looked younger, his cheeks hollow, his arms stick-thin. "I know, Liebling. Tomorrow we'll find something." It was a lie, and Thomas knew it. But he didn't protest. He had learned not to hope too loudly. The sound of boots on the stairs made everyone freeze. American soldiers. Margaret's hands began to shake. She had heard stories. Some said the Americans were fair. Others spoke of looting and worse. She pulled Thomas closer and whispered to her daughter Lisa, "Stay behind me." 2 soldiers appeared in the doorway, their forms silhouetted against the daylight above. Margarete recognized them. They had been here yesterday, the ones who had given Thomas a piece of chocolate. The boy had made it last for hours, letting it melt slowly on his tongue, savoring every molecule of sweetness. The taller one, Margarete thought she had heard him called Reilly, carried a heavy canvas bag. He set it down carefully and began pulling out items: cans of food, packages of crackers, chocolate bars, a blanket, and, Margaret's breath caught, several cans of condensed milk. "For the children," the soldier said in halting German, "für die Kinder." The other soldier, the one with kind eyes, pulled out a small packet and made a gesture of mixing and feeding. "For baby," he said, "milk powder, add water." Margarete stared at the supplies. It was more food than she had seen in months. Her vision blurred with tears. She tried to speak, to thank them, but no words would come. Instead, she began to weep, great, gasping sobs that shook her entire body. Other women began to cry as well. Frau Weber, who had lost 3 sons in Russia. Young Helena, barely 17, whose parents were missing. Old Frau Schmidt, who remembered the First War and never thought she would live to see another. The American soldiers looked uncomfortable, uncertain. The tall one knelt down and spoke to Thomas, offering him a can. "Peaches," he said, gesturing. "Good." Thomas looked at his mother, who nodded through her tears. The boy took the can with both hands, cradling it like treasure. "Danke," Margarete managed to choke out. "Danke schön. God bless you. Gott segne Sie." The soldier's eyes were shiny. He nodded, stood, and saluted, a gesture of respect that made Margarete weep harder. These men, whose country her nation had fought, whose friends had died at German hands, were showing mercy. June 15, 1945. Private James Reilly sat on the steps of a partially destroyed building, writing a letter home by the light of the setting sun. Around him, Würzburg was slowly, painfully trying to become a city again. Work crews cleared rubble. Military police maintained order. The occupation had settled into a routine, though the situation remained desperate for the civilian population. "Dear Ma, I'm sorry I haven't written in a while. Things have been busy here, though not in the way they were during the fighting. The war is over, but somehow that's made everything more complicated, not less. Remember how you always taught us at Sunday school about loving your enemies? I never really understood what that meant until now. These people here, they're our enemies, I guess. Their army killed my friends. Their country started this whole mess. But when you see a mother holding a starving baby, when you look into the eyes of a kid who's lost everything, it's hard to see an enemy. You just see people who are hurting. We've been sharing our rations with some families. I know we're not supposed to, officially, but Captain Morrison looks the other way. Most of the guys are doing it. Even Sergeant Kowalski, whose brother died at Anzio. Even he hands out chocolate bars to the kids. The thing is, Ma, it doesn't feel like charity. It feels like, I don't know, like something we have to do to stay human. Like if we walk past starving children and do nothing, we lose something important. Maybe we lose the very thing we were fighting for in the first place." Reilly paused, watching a group of German children playing in the ruins. They had constructed a makeshift ball from rags and string and were kicking it through the rubble, their laughter incongruous against the devastation. Near them, an old woman swept the steps of her destroyed house, a pointless act of normalcy that somehow felt profound. Sullivan approached, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He handed one to Reilly and sat down beside him. "You hear about Lieutenant Sanders?" he asked. "What about him?" "Got reprimanded for organizing a food distribution. Some brass from headquarters saw it happening, made a formal complaint. Sanders argued with them, said we couldn't just let people starve. They threatened him with a court-martial. Reilly felt his jaw tighten. What happened? Captain Morrison intervened, took responsibility, said he had approved it. The brass backed down, but Morrison got a written warning. Could affect his career after the war. They sat in silence, sipping the bitter coffee. In the distance, a work detail of German POWs marched past, guarded by American soldiers. The war had ended, but its aftermath was proving to be its own kind of battle. A battle between justice and mercy, between remembering the crimes and acknowledging the suffering. "You know what gets me?" Sullivan said quietly. "We spent months learning to hate these people. Had to, really, or you couldn't do what needed doing. And now," he gestured at the ruins, at the people moving through them like ghosts. "Now we have to learn something else. And I'm not sure which is harder. My priest back home used to say that evil requires us to hate it," Reilly said. "But people, even people who've done wrong, they require something more complicated." "Yeah? What's that?" Reilly thought about Margarete in the basement, about her tears when they brought food, about the way she held her baby with such desperate love. Understanding, maybe. Mercy. I don't know. Something that doesn't come easy. June the 28th, 1945. The sun was setting over Würzburg, painting the ruins in shades of amber and gold. In the basement on Friedrich Street, things had changed. The Americans had set up an official aid station 2 blocks away, providing food, medicine, and basic supplies to registered civilians. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep people alive. James Reilly made one last visit before his unit shipped out. They were being transferred to occupation duty in Frankfurt, part of the massive reorganization following Germany's surrender. He carried a canvas bag with supplies, not official issue, but items the men had pooled together. Canned goods, powdered milk, a warm blanket, a small teddy bear that someone had bought from a supply sergeant. Margarete met him at the entrance, baby Anna in her arms. The infant had gained weight. Not much, but enough to make a difference. Her eyes were brighter, her movements stronger. Thomas and Lisa stood beside their mother, looking healthier than they had 3 weeks ago. "You're leaving?" Margarete asked in careful English. She'd been practicing with Frau Weber, who had learned the language in school before the war. "Tomorrow morning," Reilly confirmed. He set down the bag. "This is for you. For all of you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they were different tears now. Not the desperate, broken sobbing of before, but something gentler. Gratitude mixed with grief, relief tinged with sadness. "How can I thank you?" she asked. "You saved my children. You saved us all." Reilly shook his head. We did what anyone should do." "No." Margaret's voice was firm. "Not anyone. You did what good men do." She paused, struggling with the words. "We were told Americans were monsters, that you would hurt us. Instead, you showed us kindness we did not deserve. Everyone deserves kindness, ma'am, especially children who had no say in any of this." Thomas stepped forward, holding out a small carved wooden cross. "For you," he said shyly in English. "My father made. Before war. I want you have it." Reilly felt his throat tighten. He took the cross carefully, feeling its weight in his palm. It was simple, unadorned, but carved with evident care. "Thank you, Thomas. I'll treasure it." The boy smiled. A real smile, the first Reilly had seen from him. As the evening deepened, more people emerged from the basement to say goodbye. Frau Weber, who insisted on kissing his cheek. Young Helena, who gave him a folded paper with a poem she had written. Even old Frau Schmidt, who pressed a tarnished wedding ring into his hand. "For your mother," she said. Tell her German mothers are not so different from American mothers. We all just want our children to live." Walking back through the ruins, Sullivan fell into step beside him. "You know what I keep thinking about," Sullivan said. "My grandfather fought in the last war, against Germany. And here we are again. Same country, same fighting. But this time," he gestured back toward Friedrich Street, "this time, maybe we're doing something different. Not just winning the war, but winning the peace." Reilly nodded, clutching the wooden cross. "My mother wrote me once about what she called the long work of healing. Said it was harder than fighting, but more important. I think I'm starting to understand what she meant." That night, in his last journal entry from Würzburg, Reilly wrote, "We came to Germany as conquerors, as liberators, as soldiers doing our duty. We saw the concentration camps and understood the evil we had fought against. But we also saw the humanity that survived beneath the rubble, mothers protecting their children, families clinging to each other, people trying to rebuild from nothing. I don't know what the future holds for Germany, for Europe, or for any of us, but I know this. When German mothers wept because American soldiers gave food to their children, something important happened. A small act of mercy in the aftermath of unprecedented horror. A reminder that even in our darkest moments we can choose compassion over cruelty. Maybe that's the real victory. Not just defeating tyranny, but refusing to let it destroy our humanity in the process. Tomorrow, we move on. But I'll carry this memory with me, always." Historical note. This story is based on documented accounts of American soldiers' interactions with German civilians in the immediate aftermath of World War II. While non-fraternization policies were officially in place, countless individual acts of kindness occurred as soldiers grappled with the complex reality of occupation. The tension between official policy and human compassion reflected in this narrative was genuine and widespread. These small acts of mercy helped lay the groundwork for Germany's eventual reconstruction and the Marshall Plan that would follow. The characters of James Reilly, Margarete Hoffman, and others are fictional, but they represent the very real experiences of millions who lived through this transformative period.